The bright lights of the CBS News studio blazed down on the set of Face the Nation as the September 1987 broadcast prepared to begin. It was a pivotal moment in Reagan's presidency. The Iran-Contra scandal was still making headlines, his approval ratings had taken a hit, and critics were increasingly questioning whether the 76-year-old president was too old and out of touch to effectively lead the nation into the final years of the Cold War. The show's producers had assembled what they considered a balanced panel for the Sunday morning political discussion. Senator Bob Dole representing the Republican perspective, Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder providing the Democratic viewpoint, and Dr. Sarah Whitfield, a 32-year-old political science professor from Georgetown University who had become a rising star in Washington's pundit circles thanks to her sharp, analytical mind and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. Dr. Whitfield had gained national attention over the past year with her scathing critiques of what she termed Reagan's nostalgic politics, the idea that his administration was stuck in outdated thinking patterns that had little relevance to the challenges facing America in the late 1980s. She was known for her direct speaking style and her ability to cut through political rhetoric with pointed observations that often made seasoned politicians uncomfortable. Host Leslie Stahl opened the program with the week's major stories before transitioning to the panel discussion. The conversation initially focused on economic policy and foreign relations, with the usual back and forth between Dole and Schroeder. But the dynamic changed dramatically when Stahl asked about Reagan's leadership style and whether age was becoming a factor in his effectiveness. Professor Whitfield, Stahl said, turning to the youngest member of the panel, "You've been quite critical of President Reagan's approach to governance. Do you think his age is affecting his ability to lead?" Dr. Whitfield leaned forward slightly, her expression serious and confident. She had clearly been waiting for this opportunity to articulate her views on national television. "Leslie, I think we need to be honest about what we're seeing," Whitfield began, her voice clear and authoritative despite her relative youth. President Reagan's approach to leadership was perhaps effective in the 1960s and early 1970s, but we're living in a rapidly changing world that requires fresh thinking and adaptive strategies. She paused, organizing her thoughts before delivering what she intended to be a knockout punch. The president's reliance on Cold War rhetoric, his faith in trickle-down economics, his communication style, all of these reflect the mindset of someone who came of age in a very different era. The harsh reality is that Ronald Reagan, both personally and politically, is old and outdated. His ideas belong to yesterday's America, not tomorrow's. The studio fell silent for a moment. Even in the combative world of Washington politics, such a direct personal attack on a sitting president was unusual, particularly on network television. Senator Dole shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Congresswoman Schroeder raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the directness of Whitfield's assessment. Stahl, sensing the significance of the moment, pressed further. "Professor, those are strong words. Are you saying that President Reagan is simply too old to be effective?" Whitfield doubled down on her critique. "I'm saying that effective leadership requires understanding the present moment and being able to envision the future. President Reagan seems trapped in a romanticized version of the past. Whether that's due to his age, his Hollywood background, or simply his fundamental worldview, the result is the same. America needs leadership that understands the challenges of the 1980s and beyond, not someone who keeps trying to recreate the 1950s. Unknown to the panel participants, President Reagan himself was watching the broadcast from the White House residence. He had made it a habit to catch the Sunday morning political shows, both to stay informed about the national conversation and to understand how his administration was being perceived by different audiences. Nancy Reagan, sitting beside her husband in their private quarters, noticed the slight smile that crossed Ronald's face as Dr. Whitfield delivered her critique. She had learned over the years to recognize that particular expression. It was the look Reagan got when he was already formulating a response to a challenge. "Are you going to let that stand?" Nancy asked quietly. Reagan chuckled softly. "Oh, I think young Dr. Whitfield has given me an excellent opportunity to make a point. Sometimes the best response to criticism is to demonstrate why it's wrong." The following Tuesday, Reagan's press secretary announced that the president would be making an unscheduled appearance on Face the Nation. The following Sunday, a highly unusual move that immediately generated speculation about what Reagan was planning to say. Dr. Whitfield, informed that she would have the opportunity to directly engage with the president she had criticized, spent the week preparing for what she expected to be a straightforward confrontation. She researched policy details, compiled statistics about economic performance, and rehearsed pointed questions about Iran-Contra and other administration controversies. When Sunday arrived, the CBS studio was packed with network executives, additional camera crews, and a larger-than-usual audience. The unprecedented nature of a sitting president responding directly to a critic on the same program had generated significant media attention. Reagan entered the studio with his characteristic confidence, greeting each panel member warmly and personally. When he reached Dr. Whitfield, he smiled genuinely and said, "Professor, I'm looking forward to our conversation. I appreciate intellectuals who aren't afraid to challenge authority." As the broadcast began, Stahl wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "Mr. President, last week Professor Whitfield characterized you as old and outdated. How do you respond to that assessment?" Reagan turned to face Dr. Whitfield directly, his expression friendly but focused. "Well, Sarah, may I call you Sarah? I have to say, your critique last week was one of the most articulate and passionate arguments I've heard in quite some time. You clearly believe deeply in your convictions, and I respect that." Dr. Whitfield seemed slightly taken aback by Reagan's gracious response, but she quickly regained her composure. "Thank you, Mr. President, but I stand by what I said. Your policies and approach reflect outdated thinking that isn't relevant to the challenges facing America today." Reagan nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your perspective, Sarah, and I think it raises an important question about the relationship between experience and wisdom. But before we dive into policy specifics, let me ask you something." The president leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming more conversational. "You mentioned that my ideas belong to yesterday's America rather than tomorrow's. But I'm curious, what do you think is the most important challenge facing young Americans like yourself as we approach the 1990s? Dr. Whitfield answered confidently. "I think the biggest challenge is adapting to a rapidly changing global economy, dealing with technological advancement, and addressing social issues that your generation largely ignored: environmental protection, income inequality, changing family structures. Those are all serious challenges," Reagan agreed. "And you're right that they require fresh thinking and innovative solutions. But let me share something with you that might surprise you." Reagan's expression grew more serious, more personal. "In 1941, I was about your age, 32 years old, full of confidence about my understanding of the world, absolutely certain that the older generation didn't grasp the realities of modern life. World War II was raging, technology was advancing rapidly, and young people like me were convinced that we had a fundamentally better understanding of how to solve problems than our parents and grandparents." The studio was completely quiet, everyone absorbed in Reagan's narrative. "I remember having a conversation with my father that year, telling him that his generation's approach to international relations was outdated, that they didn't understand the complexities of modern warfare and diplomacy. I was certain that youth and education gave me insights that his generation lacked." Reagan paused, looking directly at Dr. Whitfield. "My father listened to my passionate critique, and then he said something that I didn't fully understand until years later. He said, 'Son, The problem isn't that my generation doesn't understand your challenges. The problem is that your generation doesn't yet understand that the fundamental human challenges never really change, only the circumstances in which we face them. Dr. Whitfield remained silent, clearly engaged despite herself. Sarah, you're absolutely right that the specific challenges facing America today are different from those we faced 30 or 40 years ago. Technology has advanced, the global economy has evolved, social structures have changed. But the fundamental questions of leadership, how to inspire people during difficult times, how to build consensus around difficult decisions, how to maintain hope in the face of uncertainty, those haven't changed at all. Reagan's voice took on a more intense quality. You say my communication style belongs to an earlier era. But let me ask you this. When you're trying to convince someone to change their mind about something important, do you think the most effective approach is to demonstrate superior knowledge, or is it to help them see how your ideas connect to their own values and experiences? Dr. Whitfield considered the question carefully. I suppose it depends on the situation, but probably the latter. Exactly, Reagan said with satisfaction. And that approach to persuasion hasn't changed since. Aristotle wrote about rhetoric 2,300 years ago. The technology we use to communicate has evolved dramatically, but the fundamental principles of human persuasion remain constant. The president shifted in his chair, his posture becoming more assertive. You mentioned that my faith in trickle-down economics reflects outdated thinking. But let me challenge you on that. What do you think is the most effective way to help people who are struggling economically? Dr. Whitfield answered quickly. Direct government assistance, job training programs, investment in education and infrastructure. Those are all valuable approaches, Reagan acknowledged. But they all assume that government action is the primary driver of economic opportunity. My approach is based on a different assumption, that the most sustainable way to help people is to create conditions where they can help themselves. Reagan's voice grew more passionate. That's not an old idea or a new idea, Sarah. That's a timeless idea. The belief that human beings are capable of remarkable achievement when they have freedom and opportunity. That principle guided the founding of this country, and it will guide its future long after both of us are gone. Dr. Whitfield seemed to be struggling to formulate a response, clearly not expecting Reagan to engage with her critique on such a substantive level. But Mr. President, she said finally, don't you think your approach ignores the structural inequalities and systemic barriers that prevent many people from accessing those opportunities? Reagan smiled not dismissively, but with genuine appreciation for the question. That's an excellent point, Sarah, and it gets to the heart of what I think you're really asking about. You're not just questioning whether I'm too old to be effective, you're questioning whether my fundamental worldview is adequate to address complex modern problems. The president paused, looking around the studio before continuing. Here's what I've learned over 7 decades of life. The most dangerous mistake leaders can make is assuming that their generation has discovered entirely new problems that require entirely new solutions. Most of the challenges we face today, inequality, international conflict, environmental degradation, social division, have existed in various forms throughout human history. Reagan's tone became more urgent. The question isn't whether we understand these problems better than previous generations, it's whether we can learn from their successes and failures while adapting their insights to current circumstances. Dr. Whitfield leaned forward, clearly engaged despite her initial skepticism. But Mr. President, doesn't that risk perpetuating approaches that haven't worked? Only if we apply them blindly, Reagan replied. But if we understand the principles behind successful policies and adapt them thoughtfully to new circumstances, we can avoid both the arrogance of thinking we know everything and the foolishness of ignoring everything our predecessors learned. The president looked directly at Dr. Whitfield, his expression serious but kind. Sarah, Let me share something with you that took me many years to understand. The most important qualification for leadership isn't youth or experience, it's wisdom. And wisdom comes from combining knowledge with humility, from understanding both what you know and what you don't know. Reagan paused, then delivered the line that would be quoted for decades to come. You call me old and outdated. And maybe you're right about the old part. But if being outdated means remembering that the principles of human dignity, individual liberty, and mutual respect have worked for over 200 years, then I'd rather be outdated than untested. The studio fell completely silent. Dr. Whitfield stared at Reagan, her mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to process both the substance and the delivery of his response. Even the camera operators seemed to have stopped moving, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 seconds. Stahl attempted to break the silence. Professor Whitfield, how do you respond to the president's point? Dr. Whitfield looked down at her notes, then back up at Reagan, then down again. When she finally spoke, her voice was much quieter than it had been earlier. Mr. President, I have to admit, that's not the response I expected. I came here prepared to debate specific policies, not to discuss the philosophy of leadership across generations. Reagan smiled warmly. Sometimes the most important conversations aren't the ones we plan to have, Sarah. Dr. Whitfield was quiet for another moment, then continued with obvious sincerity. You've given me a lot to think about. I still disagree with many of your policies, but I think I may have underestimated the thoughtfulness behind your approach. And I may have underestimated the value of having my assumptions challenged by someone with your intelligence and passion. Reagan replied, That's how democracy is supposed to work, through respectful dialogue between people who see the world differently. The remainder of the broadcast continued with a substantive discussion of policy issues, but the tone had completely changed. Dr. Whitfield asked probing questions, but they were informed by genuine curiosity rather than adversarial intent. Reagan provided detailed responses that acknowledged the complexity of the issues while defending his fundamental approach. When the broadcast ended, Dr. Whitfield approached Reagan before he left the studio. Mr. President, she said, extending her hand, I owe you an apology. My comments last week were disrespectful, and they reflected assumptions that I hadn't really examined. Reagan shook her hand warmly. No apology necessary, Sarah. You challenged me to think more deeply about why I believe what I believe, and that's valuable for any leader. He paused, then added with a twinkle in his eye, Besides, if I couldn't handle criticism from brilliant young professors, I would never have survived teaching Nancy how to drive. Dr. Whitfield laughed despite herself. Thank you for being so gracious about it. Let me give you some advice, Reagan said more seriously. Never stop questioning authority. Never stop pushing for better solutions to difficult problems. But remember that effective change usually comes from building bridges, not burning them. In the days following the broadcast, clips of Reagan's response went viral in the pre-internet sense, appearing on news programs, talk shows, and newspaper opinion pages across the country. The phrase, I'd rather be outdated than untested, became a rallying cry for Reagan supporters and a grudging acknowledgement of his rhetorical skill from critics. More importantly, the exchange sparked a broader national conversation about the relationship between age and wisdom in leadership, the value of experience versus fresh thinking, and the importance of respectful political discourse, even during heated disagreements. Dr. Whitfield found herself transformed by the encounter in ways she hadn't expected. While she continued to disagree with many of Reagan's policies, she began incorporating his insights about the timeless nature of certain leadership principles into her own teaching and writing. Her subsequent academic work became more nuanced, more historically informed, and more respectful of different perspectives. Years later, as a senior professor and occasional political commentator, Dr. Whitfield would often reference her encounter with Reagan as a formative moment in her intellectual development. He taught me that being young doesn't automatically make you right, and being old doesn't automatically make you wrong, she would tell her students. Real wisdom comes from understanding which principles are timeless and which practices need to evolve with changing circumstances. For Reagan, the exchange reinforced his belief that the most effective way to respond to criticism wasn't through counterattack but through thoughtful engagement that acknowledged valid concerns while defending core principles. The moment also became part of Reagan's legacy as a communicator, not just because of his rhetorical skill, but because of his ability to transform a potentially divisive confrontation into an opportunity for mutual understanding and respect. In an era of increasing political polarization, the exchange between Reagan and Dr. Whitfield served as a reminder that substantive disagreements could coexist with personal respect, that effective leadership required both confidence and humility, and that the best responses to criticism often came not from defending one's positions, but from explaining the principles that underlie them. Most importantly, it demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful comeback isn't a clever insult or a devastating counterattack. It's a simple statement of principle delivered with conviction and grace. Reagan's one-line response left Dr. Whitfield speechless, not because it was cruel or dismissive, but because it forced her to confront the possibility that experience and wisdom might be more valuable than she had initially believed. The exchange became a masterclass in political communication, showing that the most effective leaders aren't those who win arguments through superior tactics, but those who elevate the entire conversation and leave everyone involved with a deeper understanding of the issues at stake.